Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 123, Meno 89d to E. Meno was happy with the conclusion that virtue was something teachable, and we have to wonder why Socrates didn't leave it there. If he had, Meno would have gone away with the idea that Socrates thinks that virtue is something teachable. Meno himself would have learnt nothing about virtue, let alone about teaching. When Socrates suggests that perhaps they have reached a bad conclusion, Meno immediately decides that the problem is concerning virtue being episteme, which Socrates had not said in so many words. Clearly, if virtue is episteme, knowledge or understanding, then virtue is something teachable. Socrates could have doubted the conclusion, however, not because he now suspects that virtue isn't episteme. He could have thought that they had dismissed the other options, the ones Meno asked at the beginning, too quickly or wrongly, and it may be one of the other options. He may have thought that it's a combination of options, as we saw at the beginning of the dialogue when Socrates immediately referred to the Thessalians, who were naturally good at raising horses, who were considered to be good because they raised horses, who were rich as a sign that they were considered to be good at raising horses, and they had to learn how to raise horses. They have all of the options that Meno provided Socrates at the beginning of the dialogue, but obviously Meno, who doesn't think abstractly, could not conceive of a combination of options. Another thing that Meno could have thought is that virtue is phronesis, and phronesis itself isn't episteme. Phronesis, prudence, being a virtue or virtue altogether, is an activity and not simply knowledge. All the same, if Meno has decided that that is the problem, that Socrates appears to think that virtue isn't episteme, that is what Socrates has to go with. Meno also asks what Socrates is looking at, which makes him suspect that the conclusion is bad. At the end of the last episode, I went off on a tangent about idea, because in Platonic dialogues, people tend to look at an idea to decide whether a particular concrete thing is what that idea is. For example, I can decide that a particular concrete thing is a chair if I look at the idea of a chair and the concrete particular conforms with that idea. Looking, then, is metaphorical here because we don't use our eyes to look at an abstract concept. The problem with Meno is that he doesn't think about abstract concepts, and when he says, "What are you looking at?" he means it concretely. What is Socrates looking at, which makes him suspect that this conclusion is wrong? And more specifically, what is he looking at which makes him suspect that virtue is not episteme? Before we continue, we may ask ourselves what Socrates might be looking at which makes him think that virtue isn't episteme. In fact, at the very time that Socrates had said in the hypothesis, if something is teachable, then it must be episteme or one type of episteme, we already discussed that This is according to Meno's outlook on life. He is the one who thinks that he is taught episteme by sophists. In fact, teachers do not teach episteme. What a teacher says is an opinion by that teacher, and it is up to the student to combine all of the opinions and to contrast and compare them and eventually arrive at some sort of understanding. This is the whole point of the exercise with the slave. Where does the teacher teach episteme? He doesn't. Socrates doesn't teach anything. He asks questions. He steers the student towards understanding. We might be surprised that Meno didn't immediately jump to the alternative that the teachable is not the teachable, but the recollectable. He seems to have forgotten that. We might guess, then, that Socrates will point to this as his objection. What is teachable is not episteme, but a combination of things said and shown through which the student can arrive at the student's own understanding. Or if that is still considered too difficult for Meno to understand, simply the recollectable. Things are not taught, but recalled. Now let's see what Socrates actually says. Ego soi ero o Menon, tomen gar didakton auto enai, eiper episteme estin, uk anatithemai me ukalos legestai, hotide uk estin episteme, skepsai e ansoi doko e kotos episten. I shall tell you, Meno, for that it is something teachable, if indeed it is episteme. I am not retracting that this is being said well, but that it is not episteme. Examine whether I seem to you to distrust reasonably. It's interesting that Socrates didn't say that virtue is something teachable, but that it is something teachable. He used the third-person neuter pronoun, autor, which in a way highlights the fact that didakton is also neuter, and I've always been translating that as something teachable, which itself emphasizes that Meno treats things like virtue as concrete entities. Socrates is carrying on with Meno's reverse hypothesis that if it is knowledge, then it is something teachable. The original hypothesis was if virtue is something teachable, then it is episteme, or a type of episteme. So the reverse hypothesis is if it is episteme, then it is something teachable, and now Socrates is distrusting the very reverse hypothesis itself. He doesn't think that it is episteme. If it isn't episteme, then it may not be something teachable. I hope you'll agree with me that what is teachable isn't itself episteme. That is, what comes out of the mouth of the teacher isn't what enters the brain of the student. If the teacher understands what he's saying, it still doesn't mean that the student understands. What is taught is simply words, phrases, in the best case, opinion, but not knowledge. So here is why Socrates objects. Ei estin didakton hotiun pragma, me monon arete, uk anankaion autu kai didaskalus kai mathetas enai? Emoigedoke. If any subject is teachable, not only virtue, isn't it necessary that there are teachers and pupils of it? It seems to me, uk un tunantion au, hu mete didaskaloi mete mathetai ean, kalosan auto e kadzontes e kadzoimen me didakton enai. Esti tauta, allaretes didaskaloi udokus sisoi enai. So again, the opposite, that of which there would be neither teachers nor pupils, would we not conjecture finally that it is not teachable? This is the case, but don't there seem to you to be teachers of virtue? Socrates' problem then is that if there are no teachers or students of virtue, this itself would indicate that virtue is not something teachable. If there are no teachers or students, it's not teachable. Meno accepts the premise that if indeed there are no teachers or students, then virtue is not something teachable, but he asks whether there are no teachers. Does it not seem to Socrates that there are teachers? What Meno should have said, at least, is that the absence of teachers and students is no indication that something is or is not teachable. It may be that something is not yet teachable. There are not yet teachers and students of that subject. Meno could also have pointed out that there is no such thing as teaching anyway, because as Socrates has said, there is no teaching, there is only recollection. But Meno seems to have forgotten all about recollection. All in all, Meno has not changed a bit. He has learnt nothing. And yet Socrates is still talking to him, and we should ask ourselves why Socrates is now talking about the absence of teachers, and why does Meno ask Socrates why he thinks there are no teachers. Why doesn't Meno point to teachers that he knows of virtue? You may be surprised to learn that Gorgias is not one of those teachers, and Meno knows it. We'll find that out later on. So why does Socrates mention teachers now? We'll find out next time.